So great. I think everyone that's due to join us has joined us now, Bryan. So if it's okay, let's get going. And perhaps I can start off just by asking you, I mean, where did your interest in breeding sort of come from?
I used to watch horse racing with my grandparents and uncle on Saturday afternoons when I was 11. I found I was actually more interested in the sport as an athletic event. My uncle used to talk to me about other great horses he'd seen before. My interest came from that. What happened to them? Where did the horses I was watching come from? I've always been more interested in breeding and not interested in betting, which is very peculiar, I guess.
Well, I'm not so sure it is. I think with the Foxtrot syndicates, I'd very much say we're very horse-based, if that makes sense. Yeah. I think we're very keen to understand about the horse, and that's one of the reasons that our sort of these webinars have been so popular, because people love to hear about the horses, and I think we all fall in love with those horses that we're involved in.
For a long time, actually, for a long time, I actually couldn't afford to breed horses, so I sublimated the interest by breeding and showing guinea pigs.
Right.
The biggest thing it taught me is that you can get through 30 generations of guinea pigs in 30 years. So I go right back to Eclipse in terms of guinea pigs.
There's probably no one that knows more about the breeding of guinea pigs then than you.
There may be. I've sort of forgotten a lot of what I knew now.
Brilliant. Well, I know perhaps as well as guinea pigs, but I know when it comes to horses, you've done a huge amount of research in terms of, I suppose the likely success from a given sort of mating, if you like. And can you just tell us a little bit about that research that you've done?
Yeah. When I used to be at university, I was a scientist. I did statistics as well as theoretical chemistry, so I do have a scientific background. Basically, the work I've done is to find out all the facts that might be relevant and then see which of them predict, as you say, how likely the horse that you're breeding is to be a good one. And it is absolutely how likely. There's a distribution curve, and if you might predict that the horse is most likely to be, say, a 120 horse, which would be a pretty decent jumps horse, but not a top class one, there is a certain probability that it'll also be 170. An equal probability that it'll be below 170. So basically, I work out what factors indicate the most likely rating of the horses that I'm breeding or anyone else is breeding. And to do that, I looked at the pedigrees of probably 5,000 foals, jumps foals, relating their racing ability, as measured by ratings, to the sire, the dam, the grandsire, the granddam, anything I could think of. I did it for approximately 13,000 flat horses and did a fairly complex analysis to see what was predicted, but I won't go into details of that unless you really want to. But basically what it tells me is what factors matter and what factors don't matter.
So what I suppose I'd like to know is, what are the important qualities in a stallion?
Right. That was a separate piece of work where I looked at which stallions were the most successful and then what factors predicted their success. And like a lot of the stuff I've done, I can tell you the answers. And to me, it seems pretty obvious because I already knew quite a bit of it from studying guinea pigs for so long. But it seems fairly obvious because it's rather simple. In producing a horse, you're trying to select the best male you can to breed from. And then you're trying to get her to the best stallion you can use to breed from to produce a foal. And you hope to try and match the qualities of the mare with the qualities of the stallion, and you hope everything comes out right. In terms of a stallion, the factors are pretty similar for flat stallions and for jump stallions, with one critical difference. First one, the most important one, is how good a racehorse was the stallion. So for jumps horses, I look for horses that have a time form rating of at least 120 as flat horses, which makes them just about Group 1 standard, ideally 125. Flat horses, you'd look for rather higher ones because the level of competition for pure racing ability is higher with flat. Second factor that matters to both flat and jumps is how good a sire was the stallion that produced the one you're talking about. So if you take a sire like Galileo, he would be a very positive thing for both flat sires and jump sires because he's the best stallion there's been for the last 20 years and certainly one of the best ever. So the quality of the sire is also important. The third thing that matters for jumpers, which doesn't matter so much for flat, is what was the best distance of the horse that you're choosing as a stallion. And wasn't really to my surprise, but it came out very clearly in the work that the best distance you want is a 1.5 mile horse. And the further away from a 1.5 mile you get, the less likely the stallion is to be a success. Doesn't mean he won't be, just means he's less likely to be. All of this is about probabilities. So basically, a good racehorse by a top-class stallion that was best at a 1.5 mile. They're the optimum for a jump stallion. It's nice if they've got a pedigree further back, but I'd say nice only. That it must matter that the dam of the stallion has some ability and that the broodmare sire has, the dam sire has ability. But the thing you can measure is the ability of their sire, because there's lots of information about that. So that's why that's one of the most important factors. And the racing ability goes without saying. If a horse has good racing ability, it's got good genes for racing ability. And so if it's got good genes for racing ability, it's more likely to pass them on. That's not rocket science.
So just taking you up on that point, you know, I've heard of mares in particular that the owners have said, well, you know, I'm not sure I want to race it. It's well bred. Which is the better horse to breed from? A mare who has good racing form, or a mare and perhaps average sort of parenthood, if you like, or a mare that has, you know, is exceptionally well bred but hasn't performed on the race course?
That's a really good question, Dan, because I started all this work after an argument with my then wife. I say then wife because I turned out to be right and she was wrong. My then wife about that very subject. She believed that the breeding of the mare was the most important factor. I believe that the racing ability was, because that's what came through in guinea pigs. The best looking guinea pigs produce the best looking guinea pigs, no surprise. So when I looked at that work, the single most important factor in a broodmare when she first retires to stud is her own racing ability. It helps if she's by a very good stallion. That's clearly supportive to that. It helps if her dam has bred 2 or 3 good winners, because again, all of that provides evidence that that they're likely to have the genes that will pass on to the foal. But the single most important factor when they retire to stud is, does the mare have good racing ability? Now, once she's retired and she's been at stud for a few years, hopefully is still alive, then you look at her produce. And if she's a good producer, then that can add up. So you switch from one to the other. So you start off with racing ability is everything, and then gradually it becomes less important, and the producing ability goes up. But essentially, what the mare herself has done, either as a racehorse or as a producer, is the single most important factor, backed up by her pedigree, but backed up by. And the other thing I'd say, which a lot of breeding people find controversial, is after the mare's important and the grand dam has got some important, after that, it's ancient history. People that talk about the families and 5x6 inbreeding and the influence of distant ancestors, it's complete, utter, I was going to say a word that I can't say in this, I'll say balderdash, it's a similar word that I was going to use. So a lot of rubbish is talked about the influence of distant ancestors. What you see in front of you is the most important thing, and the most important thing you see in front of you is the racing ability of the mare.
I mean, that's very interesting from your perspective, and I can assure you from my perspective, when I'm buying horses, you know, I get this, often get these people who ring me up, particularly from Ireland, funny enough, telling me this horse is great you know, grandfather was then, you know, half sister to this horse that won the champion hurdle. Well, sounds ridiculous to me, and it sounds like, you know, very similar to you. It's actually, you know, the further you go back and the less direct relative it is, it really becomes fairly irrelevant.
Yeah, you shouldn't need spreadsheets as I've got to prove that. It's obvious. The further back, every generation, the genetic influence on average halves. So by the time you're 3 or 4 generations back, there's quite a few ancestors. There's 64 in 5 generations. So you go back 5 generations, there's an awful lot of others that aren't one of the good ones you're talking about. So look at what's in front of you. As a famous breeder once said, gold is where you find it, and the easiest place to find it is on the surface.
Well, we're getting lots and lots of questions, and just a reminder to everyone, if you've got any questions for Bryan, there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So if you press that, you can type in any questions, and at the end, I'll pass on particularly the most common questions or the most interesting questions to Bryan, and he'll be very keen to answer those from our members. So But Bryan, let's just talk about sizing John. Obviously won the Gold Cup. I mean, first of all, what about the day itself? I mean, were you there? How did you celebrate? Tell me about the experience of seeing your horse crossing the line in the Gold Cup.
Give you a little bit of background. I was there for the 2 previous years. 2 years previously, he was 3rd in the Supreme Novices, beaten by Douvan. A year earlier, he was 2nd in the Arkle, beaten by Douvan. First year, I was very pleased to get a place at Cheltenham. Second year, it sounds ridiculous. I was actually quite frustrated because I was convinced they were running him over the wrong distance against a horse who was much better than he was at 2 miles. Douvan was potentially a great horse. He suffered injuries, but he was an outstanding horse and beat John every time they met. So I'd never knocked down Douvan. The year of the Gold Cup, he moved to Jessica Harrington, and Robbie Parr, I think, said that he needed a distance of ground. And when I read that, I thought, eureka, I'd been saying that to everyone that would listen for the previous year. And so she ran him over 2.5 miles. He won well. She then won the Irish Gold Cup, and he went for the Gold Cup, which is the dream of every breeder or every jumps breeder, is to produce a Gold Cup winner. I went down with my wife's daughter for the meeting. The first thing I remember is sitting in the car park thinking, I wish I weren't here, because it meant so much. The build-up had gone on, and there's always the feeling it could go horribly wrong, and something you've wanted for a long time is just not going to happen. So that was the first thing. Had a couple of glasses of wine at lunch, and I didn't feel quite as tense after that. Then I remember being in the paddock. We sort of blagged our way into the paddock by a very nice gateman that led us in, and we watched the race on the paddock. But before the race started, the odds went up on the board, and Sizing John was 7-1 and 4th favourite. And I remember thinking, there's never going to be a better chance than this. The race itself went like a dream. The horse ran pretty well as he should, although Robbie was on the inside early on, which he didn't intend to be. He hit the front at the second last with a wonderful jump, came up the line and won, and the two of us were just dancing around. It was incredible, because other good things happen in your life, but rarely is there something that's that important, that's that tense, and that is decided by something completely out of your control, how that horse runs on that day. So the relief of tension was enormous. Celebration, we went to our friends Peter and Emma Hocknell at Shade Oak that night, drank several bottles of champagne, and I think we gave some carrots to Peregrine, didn't we? Yes, we gave Peregrine some carrots. That was daughter's idea. So it was a good celebration. It was a truly wonderful day. Don't expect it'll ever repeat, but you keep on trying.
Well, what a fantastic...
Yes, it will, she's saying.
Well, let's hope so. And what a fantastic day. And you mentioned there La Peregrine, and of course she's also the dam of Anything for Love. Can you just tell us a little bit about her? How did you acquire her, and how did that story all come about?
Well, Peregrine, my then wife Sandra, as I said, I used to argue with her about breeding principles, but she was a better judge of horses than I was. We went to Doncaster Sales in 2003, and Peregrine won a store show. They used to have before the store sales, they used to have a show, and Peregrine won the 3-year-old class, and Sandra was impressed by her. I was impressed, but didn't know enough. I wasn't a good enough judge of horses at that time to really see it. We then had a couple of horses in training with Howard Johnson, and I got to know Howard well, and I get on well with Howard. And we saw Peregrine there. She was the queen of the mare's yard, and she was always a very good-looking mare, and I could see that. One day, I was having a drink with Howard at Doncaster Sales. She'd just turned 6 years old, and she'd had an injury. And over at the bar, Howard said, "Oh, do you want to buy Peregrine?" I said, "You mean Peregrine, do you? You mean Peregrine, Howard?" "Yes." "Yes, I'd be very interested. What's the price?" Well, he named a price, and we haggled, and I bought the mare for something slightly more than half what he asked for, which was probably more than she was worth, because Howard's a good trader. But actually, it was one of the best buys I ever made, clearly. So I bought her at Doncaster Sales, but not in the auction, in the bar.
Well, that's where, of course, a lot of good bargains are found. In the
Well, I've certainly done. Probably, I bought more mares decently, privately, than at auctions. It's easier, and you know what you're getting into much more straightforwardly. At an auction, you've got to value the mare, stick to that valuation, and stop. You've got to be very disciplined at an auction. When you're buying privately, you can think about things, you can talk to the person, you can make up your mind to suit you. There's not the same pressure.
And what was it about her that attracted? Obviously, you mentioned about your ex-wife, so liking the look of her. Was that the main thing, or were there other factors as well?
No, it wasn't by then. First factor was when she was sold at that store sale, she brought very good money. So clearly there were several people that thought how good looking she was. Her pedigree was, maybe in those days I probably followed pedigrees more than I do now because I hadn't done the work at that time, although I still was of the opinion racing ability mattered most. Her pedigree was okay, but actually slightly weak at that time in terms of her sire. If I'd known that Northern Crystal wasn't quite as good a sire as he might have been, maybe I wouldn't have bought her, but I was lucky enough and I didn't know that then. Actually, I found out since then he's a good broodmare sire, so he's not a weakness. But Peritine was also a good racehorse. Howard had her, she won 4 races out of 8. She went wrong in a race when Howard was forced to run on ground that was too firm for her at Newbury. He always thought she was a much better horse than she was able to show. He thought she'd be a very good steeplechaser because she's big, very good looking, and looked all over like a steeplechaser. So I thought there was unfulfilled potential, and she was a beautiful mare. And maybe at the time I had the money. Didn't always in those days, but I maybe did that day.
So she obviously produced a Gold Cup winner and Anything for Love. And one thing I wanted to ask you, Bryan, is why is Anything for Love called Anything for Love?
Well, I will do anything for love, Dan, but I won't tell you that. Now, basically, I'm a Meatloaf fan. I also am a fan of Bob Dylan. One of her earlier foals we called Bateau to Hell because she decided to wean herself by running away from the mare when we were going to send Peritine over to Ireland for the winter. So Bateau to Hell weaned herself in the field and became called Bateau to Hell. When we had one of her foals had a heart-shaped blaze, and we called her Dead Ringer for Love. I thought that was better than calling a Bleeding Heart because the blaze went slightly lower down, so we called her Dead Ringer for Love. Then we had an argument about Anything for Love, and I lost the argument. My wife wanted to call her after another Meatloaf song, Anything for Love. Again, the blaze. I wanted to call her after Sizing John. I wanted to call her Visions of Johanna, to remind us of John, but I lost that argument, so she's still named after a Meatloaf song.
Great. Well, it's a very interesting story, and I think we're probably glad you lost that argument, but probably shouldn't.
Well, you don't like Visions of Johanna? It's a great name.
No.
Right, so let's go back to the stallions, and obviously Sizing John stallion was Midnight Legend. Can you just tell us a little bit about him?
Yeah, Midnight Legend was a stallion that made it from very difficult beginning. He started as a flat racehorse. He was a good horse, but not a very good horse. He won a listed race. Over jumps, he was very good hurdler, but unfortunate enough to come up against 2 better hurdlers in the biggest race he ran in, which was the Aintree Hurdle. He was beaten by Estebrac and French Holly. And he, again, to be honest, he wouldn't pass all the tests I set myself now. He was by a stallion Night Shift who was a good styer, but nothing like a Galileo class. He was a good horse, but not 120 or time form rated, although maybe just about if he converted his hurdles rating. So he was not one that early on in his career would have rated. He then went to Kathleen and David Holmes, who'd become very good friends of mine. He started to produce the goods for them. And that's where the statistics came in, because I analysed the results of stallions in terms of the production every year. In fact, for jumps horses, I updated at Christmas and then at the end of the season. And after he'd been at stud for a few years, it became obvious that Midnight Legend was outperforming the expectations that you could have from him, from his racing ability and pedigree. Whatever it was, he was putting something into the foals that he was producing, and producing more winners than you would expect. And I remember writing, I wish all my articles were as prescient as this one. I wrote an article in Thoroughbred Owner Breeder in 2009 saying that Midnight Legend and Cave Tara were underrated British stallions, just as good as the ones in Ireland. And I was using them that year. 3 of the 4 foals born the next year were black type winners, and that's by a long way the best ratio I ever had and ever will have. 2 of them were by Midnight Legend. One was Sizing John, the other was by Cave Tara, and that was Lifeboat Mona. Incidentally, the other 2 I bought back for a lot more than I sold them for. They're both broodmares now in the broodmare band. But Midnight Legend did it the hard way by showing real ability to sire good horses, tough horses like he was. Sorry, I've lost the link now, Dan.
Sorry, can you? Are you back?
I can hear you now. Yeah,
just
I can hear you now.
for a second, but I think you're back now.
I wasn't sure whether you just glazed over my last answer. That's all.
No, that was great. And so, just obviously talking about stallions, talking about Midnight Legend, but you're also involved with Telescope, who, as many of our members will know, Midnight Silver was covered by for the first 2 foals that she's had. So, can you just explain a little bit about Telescope and how that came about, and why you've selected, Telescope as a potentially top class stallion?
Right. Peter and Emma Hocknell have been friends for many years. When we first got into breeding, I visited Peter to look at his stallions. One of them was Alflora. Actually, I found him very straightforward, as I'm sure you do. He answers questions honestly and openly. Not all stallion managers do that. A minority don't, obviously. But Peter I found very easy to get on with because he's an enthusiast and he tells the truth. And for 2 or 3 years before, there was a certain amount of concern that his stallions were not of the quality that they had been in the past. He had Blackstone Bellamy that he asked together, and he didn't have really a backup to Blackstone. So I had more time in some I look at more flat racing in summer than he does, and I started looking for who might make good. The first one I identified, Peter sent off a bloodstock agent to look at this one. And the guy came back with a story that the problem with the stallion was lovely pedigree, good racehorse, but too small, too narrow, and his testicles were too small. And the last bit worried Peter especially. Actually, it's not affected his stud career. The next one I found was Cavalryman, and we were watching him, and we'd got a provisional agreement that he might stand at Shade Oak when he broke his leg in Dubai and had to be put down. You'll now start to see a pattern. The next one I identified was Brown Panther. And Brown Panther, Michael Owen went round to Peters and a deal was done that Brown Panther was going to stand there, but they just wanted to run him one more time in the Irish St. Leger. In the Irish St. Leger, Brown Panther broke a leg and had to be put down. So this hadn't gone well. However, just before the Irish St. Leger, daughter and I were on holiday in Turkey, and I read in the EBN that Telescope, who's a horse I'd watched run lots of times on the flat, I thought was a very good racehorse, very good looking, but probably unaffordable because he was likely to win a Group 1. Telescope had gone wrong. I rang Peter from Turkey and said, you've got to arrange to go to see Michael Stote as soon as I get back. We've got to go and see him because I think he could be a 1. On the way down to Michael Stote's, Brown Panther was still, it was still alive then and was still likely to get him. And I remember Peter saying, I really don't want 2 stallions and I hope I don't like this one. I said, well, I think you're going to have a problem then, unless I've misjudged him by seeing him on TV, which is the only place I'd seen him. Telescope came out and he was lame because he'd had a bad injury. Peter immediately liked him very much. I always did like him. We had to discuss whether the injury was enough that he could get over it and he could stand next year, and eventually he did. We haggled a bit about the price and eventually bought him. That was probably the best investment I ever made in a horse, because so far he's proved very successful commercially. I hope he'll prove very successful as a stallion of racehorses in the next 2 or 3 years. Why I picked him is he ticks all 3 boxes. Time form rating 129, by Galileo, the world's greatest stallion. Best distance a mile and a half, and just to add to it, he's sort of a Darshan mare. Darshan was an outstanding broodmare sire, and Telescope is a very good-looking horse, idealised, not too big, not too small, and a beautiful walker. And just to please Peter, it turned out that he only bred bays, which often when he goes to a grey mare, he can't breed a chestnut. So Peter was delighted with that because he's racially prejudiced against chestnuts. He's got a weakness there. That's how we got Telescope.
No, that's very, very interesting. And so for those of people that aren't familiar with Telescope, can you just explain, when it is we'll start to find out whether or not actually he is a successful stallion?
Yeah. In his first year at stud, he covered a small number of flat mares, but they were not really the sort of mare you'd expect to make a big impression. basically it was good to have people trying. One of the first foals finished second in a decent race last year as a 2-year-old, but I would never judge him on his flat products. The test comes for jump stallions when they start to have runners over jumps. Telescope's oldest horses are only 3. It may be that the odd one will run in a bumper at the back end of this year. I've got one in Ireland that's showing promise and she may well do it, but it may be that we'll wait until she's a 4-year-old. The real test comes for a jump stallion when they have 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds. You need them to be showing some promise with the first 5-year-olds. And by the time they've got 6-year-olds, you know an awful lot about them. And then I would switch at that stage from relying on my initial impressions of the stallion's racing ability and pedigree and so on, I'd switch to what's he done. So by this time a jump size got 6-year-olds, I can look at the stats and say, okay, this horse is on a trajectory to be a very good one, or a good one, or not to make it. So 3 years time we'll know for sure, 2 years time we'll have a very good idea. If it turns out that he's not an outstanding stallion, then I've dropped an enormous, I'll have to dash out the word I'm going to say. It's the same one as I almost used before, because I've sent a lot of mares to him because I strongly believe in him. And so I've either done a very smart thing, sending a lot of good mares to Telescope because I believe in the horse, or I've done a really dumb thing. The greatest breeder of all time was probably Federico Tizio, who bred Niarco and Rebo. He never kept a stallion because he didn't want to be biased. So I'm doing something the greatest breeder of all time didn't do, and the guy was a genius. I just hope to get lucky on this one.
Well, we wish you the very best with Telescope, and of course we're very much hoping that he's very successful because we've now got 2 foals by him. So let's hope things work out for both of us.
Yes.
So just moving on then, just thinking sort of internationally, and I may be wrong here, Bryan, but I sort of get the impression that the French horses are now starting to dominate, might not be the right word, but coming at a higher level than some of the British horses, particularly in the main festivals.
Yeah.
Firstly, do you think that's fair, and have I misjudged that? But if I haven't, what are the French doing differently to us?
No, you haven't misjudged it. I first noticed it something like 10 years ago and wrote something about it. I don't know if it ever got published. I then looked at it again 2 years ago and found exactly the same factors. And every analysis I do say the French are overperforming in terms of the number of horses that race in this country compared with the numbers they breed. Now, you have to remember that the ones racing in this country are often specially selected as having shown form in France. They're not sending the worst ones over here. But even allowing for that, the French are overperforming. I've looked at the way they breed them. There are a couple of slight differences. One is that they're more likely to use horses that succeeded over hurdles and fences than we do. Yeah, there's been a bias in this country and Ireland. Trainers don't like to train in tyres. They like to train geldings. The French are more likely to keep some of the horses in tyre to give them a chance at stud. But that is not the explanation for the French supremacy. It may explain part of it, it's not the full explanation. Okay. Second thing is that they test their mares more. They're more likely to insist on using a mare that won, even if she didn't win a top class race, and not to agonize about pedigrees going back 2, 3, 4 generations, as you mentioned earlier. So French brood mares are more likely to have raced at a level successfully than British and Irish ones are. That again is not enough to explain all the differences. And I know exactly how the numbers work and it doesn't explain it. What's left, and let's follow Sherlock Holmes here. When you rule out everything that might be a possibility, then whatever's left, no matter how improbable, is probably the explanation. The single obvious explanation that's left is that the French have a totally different way of raising their horses. They race them typically at 3. The mares especially are tested at 3. A lot of them retire by the time they're 5 and go to stud. But they also race top-class geldings at 3. Koto Star first raced, I think, in March as a 3-year-old. Masterminded raced as a 3-year-old. Duvan, I think, might have been slightly later, but he was racing certainly as a 4-year-old. Album Photo races a 3-year-old, and all of these horses race over obstacles early in life. So the French are breaking the horses earlier, and they're teaching them to jump earlier. And it's not surprising. Guillaume Mayoh was on. It's not surprising the success. Guillaume Mayoh was on TV a few weeks ago on Nick Luck's program, and he said a very obvious statement, but it's not obvious to a lot of British and Irish trainers. What he said was, you don't teach a child to ski at the age of 15 if you want to produce a champion skier. Teach them to ski at 5, they're more likely to succeed. I don't think Usain Bolt started running when he was 16. He probably started running pretty fast when he was 5 or 6. The French test the horses earlier. Now, some people think that that means that they don't last as long. I've done the work on that, and the French horses do last as long as the British and Irish. They may peak earlier and finish a little bit earlier, but they last as long, that you get just as much out of them, and you don't have to wait so long to race them. More importantly, they reach a higher level than the pedigree suggests they should reach, because I believe of their upbringing. So any horses that I keep, that I intend to race, go to Ireland when they're 2 years old, they're broken at 2 years old. Before they even go there, we've loose schooled them in our own arena, so they're used to lifting their legs up and jumping small poles. They go to Ireland and they're broken at 2. They go back again in autumn at 2 and they're jumping. They go again in spring at 3. So we're not pushing them to race as early, but we are teaching them to use their brains and know how to jump and know how to gallop. And hopefully it will give them an advantage. Anything for Love had that upbringing. She was slightly slower maturing than some of them are, probably because Black Sam Bellamy's size slow maturing stock. But you got them there, and 6 weeks later she ran and won because she'd done a hell of a lot. Hopefully we'll find next season that she jumps very well, because she always has when she's been here and at Dennis Leahy's in Ireland. So hopefully the brains are working properly, and I'm sure that's why the French are doing so well.
I mean, that's really fascinating, Bryan, because in my experience, so many people have said to me, actually, owning young horses is all about patience and almost not doing much with them and letting their bodies develop and so on. But the impression I get is actually, although we want to be patient for them racing, almost introducing those ideas is almost toughening up their bodies ready for racing. Would that be fair?
That's my opinion. It's not just the bodies. I think it's toughening up the brains. It's making their brains have reflexes that, here's the hurdle and I jump it, rather than horses seeing it at 5 years old. And I've seen them at some stage, trainers at 5 years old, no idea what to do because they've never been taught to jump. You're absolutely right. The patience comes when you decide when to put the horse in full training and how early to run it and how much to ask of it early. Some horses will be ready to race at 3 or 4. Some will need to be 4 or 5. That's why Anything for Love, we waited till she was 4 or 5, because Dennis Leahy in Ireland said she needed that time. But she'd done plenty of work, but not stressful work. So you're absolutely right. You teach them to use their limbs and to toughen up mentally and to understand how to jump, but you don't have to abuse them early on. Some horses are ready for it, some aren't. But I don't, by abuse, I mean race them hard. Yeah, I don't mean abuse them physically, obviously.
So does that mean that we ought to reconsider the race program? I mean, I remember watching a bumper last season, of which there were 4 6-year-olds in the bumper. Yeah. Do you think the British race program needs to be slightly tinkered with, or perhaps different races introduced to help bring through horses more gradually?
I'm absolutely convinced of that. I think you're totally right about the bumpers. You look at the Cheltenham bumper, you typically see 6-year-olds in it, sometimes winning it. Then the rest of them are usually 5-year-olds. And those horses are then going to see a hurdle when they're 5 going on 6 or 6 going on 7. But Sizing John won a Gold Cup when he was 7. So the fact that a horse is running in the Cheltenham bumper when it's 6 is not really a great backing. In terms of the racing programme, my next cunning plan for the racing programme is precisely that. I would like to do 2 things. One of them I think I'll get, the other one I may not get. The first is to introduce a series of races that I'd like to call National Hunt Juvenile Hurdles. And these would run from October, when the horse is a 3-year-old, until April, when it's a 4-year-old. They would not be open to any horse that has run racing before the 1st of October. So the bumper horses can't run in them, black horses can't run. They're for horses that haven't run anywhere. So they'd model what the French already do. They have juvenile hurdles actually in March. I think that's sooner than we're ready for over here to Maybe one day we can, but to promote that now, I get nowhere. So push it from 1st of October and go to 1st of April. An important part of that, though, is that they should have a special status. If a horse wins a juvenile hurdle today, it's out of novice status for the whole of the next season. Now, we want to use these as a development, so they should have exactly the same status as bumpers or point-to-points. A horse winning a National Hunt juvenile hurdle should be able to run in novices for the whole of the next season. I talked about one trainer, to one trainer, well, that's terrible. It gives them an unfair advantage. I said, great, you got it. That's precisely what we're trying to do. We're trying to give an advantage to horses that are developed earlier and get them racing earlier and get money back for the owners earlier, but most importantly, get them to a higher level later. So that's the first part of it. The second part, I would de-emphasize bumpers. I think it's a bad mistake when the Cheltenham bumper was introduced, and I didn't always think this. If I'd been talking 2 years ago, I wouldn't have said this. I think the Cheltenham bumper causes people to keep racing horses on the flat far too long, and all the other black tie bumpers do the same. So I would limit horses to 3 runs in bumpers, and I'd have none of them worth black tie. Treat them as development races. That bit I don't expect to get because the trainers will howl like mad about that, but I hope to get the first one. Get these National Hunt novice hurdles, juvenile hurdles earlier. I think it's the single most important thing we can do to the racing programme that will help British and Irish horses compete with the French.
Bryan, could you just repeat for us who would be eligible for those races? I didn't quite catch that. Just tell us again who'd be eligible for these new races.
Any horse that hasn't run under any rules of racing before 1st of October. Doesn't matter what they were bred for, so long as they haven't run under any rules of racing, they can go in these races. But they're hurdle races. They're not bumpers, so they're going to have to jump. So they'll have to be taught before they run. So why I call them National Hunt, it doesn't mean the National Hunt bred, is to just indicate that they have a special status, that horses running in these races are still eligible to run in novice hurdles for the whole of the next season.
And presumably these races may not need to be over 2 miles or may not need to have 8 hurdles. I mean, could you run them, over a mile and a half and say have 3 or 4 hurdles?
No, I wouldn't do that because they'll go too fast. If you go over 2 miles and have 8 hurdles, they'll go hopefully a steady pace and they'll have to jump the hurdles because the hurdles are there to be jumped. And these horses are nearly 4 years old, right? That's an age when a 3-year-old has won the St. Leger. It's an age when some horses like Stradivarius are winning over 2 miles. They're perfectly capable of winning over 2 miles at a sensible pace in October as 3-year-olds. Especially since hurdles make the horses run more slowly. They have to jump them, and a hurdle race isn't run at the same speed as a flat race. So I think it's a nonsense to say these horses can't run over 2 miles as late 3-year-olds. They do it on the flat. Why can't these? And again, to take the example that you mentioned earlier, the French do it. The French races are over 2 miles, and they run them in March. So I'm talking about October.
Well, very interesting. And obviously you mentioned about you looking to introduce this. I know that you're an elected member of the TBA. What does that actually mean? What is that role?
Well, the TBA is important, the Thoroughbred Breeders Association, because it's the only organisation in British racing that thinks about British breeding and the future of the thoroughbred breed. If you look at the ROA or the Racecourse Association or any of the BHA, none of them spend very much time worrying about the future of the breed. There is one organisation that does, and that's the TBA. So I focus on the TBA because I'm a breeder and I'm interested in breeding, and any ideas I have are to help improve the breed. The TBA gives me a chance to influence that and make it happen. That's why I work through the TBA. I first got involved with the TBA on the National Hunt Committee a number of years ago, and at that time we developed the Elite Mare scheme, which there was already an embryonic scheme where decent mares retiring to stud would get a free nomination to a stallion for 1 year. We talked about it, and I came up with a much more adventurous version, which is let's encourage all good race mares that are located in Britain to visit British stallions. So the Elite Mare scheme gives free or heavily subsidised nominations to any mare rated more than 130. The higher the rating, the bigger the nomination. We got that. Then a couple of years later, after that was in, plus 10 came along, and at that time I think it was called Bobis, and the whole scheme was focused on flat. There was nothing that focused on jumps. I had a look at trying to model that and do it for jumps, and I couldn't make the numbers work. I couldn't make the finances work. We'd be asking for too much money to provide an ambitious scheme for both colts, geldings and mares over jumps. So I then came up with the idea, I think I was sitting on the loo one day when I came up with this idea, that we'd have it only for mares, and we'd call it the Mare Owners Prize Scheme, MOPS, because mares are the single biggest problem for jumps breeders in National Hunt. There's been very little demand for them. Typically, they're bringing around a quarter of the price of geldings. So when you have a mare born, and it's still true to some extent today, you have a filly born, and you think, oh my God, I'm thousands of pounds down. We need to change that. And the only way to change it is to offer serious incentives, people to race, to purchase and race mares. So MOPS was the first attempt at that. I joined the TBA because at that time, the entire board of the TBA were flat breeders. There wasn't a single jumps breeder on it. And we weren't getting very far with that board. And so I decided to follow the old premise that if you can't beat them, join them, and then a new premise, and then beat them from the inside. Now, don't quote that to any present members of the TBA board, but that was the policy. And I had an election campaign where I relied on the jumps studs to help promote my candidacy. I then got on the board and pushed it, and we got MOPS through. So MOPS got in because I thought it would change the behavior of jumps breeders, and bit by bit it is doing that. The next one we're trying to do is far more adventurous than MOPS. The prizes will be bigger. We were due to announce it on the 26th of March. And something called coronavirus got in the way of that announcement. So hopefully when racing resumes, a new improved scheme will come along, which will apply to both flat and jumps, but offer much bigger prizes for British bred, British side mares. So if you're talking about jumps mares, a mare's only bump will win £10,000 prize in addition to the prize money, some of which goes to the breeder, some goes to the trainer, most of it goes to the owners. A mare winning a novice hurdle will win £20,000 prize, and you can win any number of them. Now, I very much hope, and you know this, Dan, I very much hope to see Anything to Love win 3 of them next year, 2 for practice and then a listed race. So that's the mission. But
sounds very good to me. I think we'll both be very happy if that plan comes off.
You don't think I'm being a bit mean and only aiming for 3, do you?
I'll settle for 3. Yeah,
okay,
3 wins will do nicely, won't it?
Yeah, I would.
So, and Bryan, one of the questions we've had, which perhaps I can bring up now since we're talking about the schemes, is how are the mare schemes funded? Where does the sort of the money come from, right, which we're then giving out?
Yeah, MOPS, it all comes from the levy board. Yeah, for many years the levy board used to give breeders prizes, which were at one stage pretty generous, like I think £10,000 to win the Cheltenham Gold Cup. When I eventually luckily did that, the prize was 0, because we had to forego the breeders prizes to say this is more important. Incentivizing owners to buy these mares and incentivizing breeders to race these mares is more important than saying thank you very much to someone that bred a horse 10 years ago. So it came from the levy board provide the funding. It came from sacrificing breeders prizes to a heavy extent. Under the new scheme, which is more ambitious, the levy board will still provide the bulk of the funding, but some of it will come from nominations. So a breeder to enter the scheme will have to pay a fee when the horse is a foal, and again when the horse is a yearling. The person that owns the horse as a 3-year-old, the first 2 things will entitle the breeder to 10% and another 10% of the prizes. So the breeder's betting on their own produce. I wanted to call it BOPS because that was Peter Hocknell's idea, bet on your own produce scheme, but we didn't get to call it that. But basically the breeder is effectively playing for their own money, in that they put money into the scheme and they get money out when later the horse they bred wins a race. They get 10% for the foal stage, 10% for the yearling stage. The 3-year-old stage is paid by the owner of the horse when it's 3, which might still be the breeder, or it might be someone that's pinhooked it. All that will go to the owner and connections at the time the horse wins the race. So the person that pays that is getting nothing, but hopefully if they don't race the horse themselves, they're hopefully going to get a higher price for the horse when they come to sell it. But the levy board will be paying approximately 80% of the cost of this, and we had to fight a long campaign to get this. It took about 2 years to get the scheme through, and lots of arguments. I think the paper that was finally agreed was version 21. It's on my computer. So version 21 was agreed. No, we're about to announce it with coronavirus. No people are saying, can we afford it? So we're having to fight to say, yes, we can, because by the way, you're not paying any prizes this year. So what you had budgeted for this year, you're not going to spend. Next year, hopefully the levy income will be back up, and British breeding will need this help more than ever, because what happened after the last recession, foal crops dropped much more than horses in training, much more sharply. There will be a real drop in foal crops and a real weakness in the race program in several years' time unless action's taken. That's the argument we'll put to the levy board, and I think we'll win it.
Well, it certainly sounds like you're doing some great work there, Bryan, and you know, on behalf of our syndicates, will hopefully take advantage of those bonuses.
Yeah, I hope you will.
your hard work. And so let me just throw another couple of questions. I think we've got maybe 5 minutes left, so let's throw another couple of questions. And they you mentioned the coronavirus, and a number of members have asked me in various different forms, but let me sort of bring those questions together into one. How do you think the coronavirus situation is going to impact upon the breeding industry?
Yeah. This year, the TBA has done a lot of work to stop it impacting at all. There was some concern early on that vets may not be able to do scanning of mares to check that they're ready for covering, scanning when they have been covered. The TBA did a lot of work with DEFRA, and some of the work we've done on Brexit helped with that. We got good contacts with DEFRA and DCMS, and we got approval through the veterinary college that work could continue, so long as reasonable precautions were taken for the safety of the vets doing the work. The studs are already taking precautions. If you take a mare in to be covered, you've got to stay in the horse box. The mare is taken away and covered and then brought back. People at the studs are trying to keep 2 meters apart, so they're doing everything they can to avoid coronavirus spreading there. I think the movement of horses is not likely to have a big effect, but that was the first real test. There was a serious danger the covering season could end at the start of April, which would have been disastrous. Hopefully we've avoided that, and hopefully we'll continue to avoid it for the next 2.5 months. Some breeders perhaps will decide not to cover this year because of uncertainty. I think that the foal crop will drop in England and Ireland because of that. After that, it will depend what happens to the economy. If breeders can't afford to breed, or owners can't afford to buy them, then there could be an effect on prices at the sales later this year. And I think we've all got to expect that to a degree. Maybe decide to keep those horses until the 3-year-olds. Because when I looked at what happened last time, after 2008, there was an immediate drop in the number of runs of horses in races. The foal crops dropped much more rapidly. The recovery in horses running happened fairly soon, and then was held back because there weren't the horses having been bred when the foal crops dropped to support the race program. So I think the important thing is for breeders to survive in the next 2 years, and owners to run their own businesses as best they can and keep on being able to survive. There has got to be an impact. This is a serious recession. It'd be a miracle if there weren't an impact on both things. We've got to try and mitigate the impact as best we can, and the TBA has got to make damn sure that it mitigates it, especially for British bred horses and British racing.
Well, as you say, I'm sure it's going to impact upon all aspects of racing, but also all parts of our lives as well. So, no, very interesting. And let's just take another question. This one's from John. Are you still breeding, and have you bred yourself this year? And what youngsters have you got coming through that we ought to perhaps be looking out for in a year or two?
Yes, I'm still breeding because I have 20 broodmares. 21, I'm being corrected. I think some of them are only part-owned. She's right. This is what wives do. They correct you without knowing all the facts. Anyway, I have this number of broodmares. I was going to send some of them, a small number too, to Crystal Ocean in Ireland because we tried to buy him, and then we're outbid by Coolmore, and it kind of seemed like unfinished business. When this came along, it seemed a damn sight easier to visit a stallion that I've got a part share in, and all the mares I've got to do is walk across the yard and say hello to Telescope or Dartmouth and be covered. So they're all being covered by Telescope or Dartmouth. So the crazy thing I described earlier of eggs in one basket is even more so this year, but they're all being covered. I'll have approximately 15 foals born this year. I intend to keep 3 or 4 of them to race depend. Basically, I choose them on the metrics I said to you. Which ones, according to my score sheet, are the most likely to produce good racehorses. Now, it doesn't mean they will. I have no idea whether this one's better than that one. So basically, I choose them on that. And also, if I've got a particular affection for the mare, I keep them. And if I've not got a foal before from the mare, I keep them. Peritine had a foal this year, so she'll be one I will keep. It looks a very nice foal. Peritine has now decided she's a very important lady, and having produced the foal, decided not to produce any milk to feed it. So we had to get colostrum into the foal from the bank at Shade Oak. We had to get a foster mother, who luckily we were able to get the same day from Yorkshire. The foster mother took to the foal immediately. I don't know if you want to know this, but one of the ways you can get a foster mother to adopt a foal is if she's had a dead foal, you do a gruesome thing. You take the skin off the foal and you put it onto the foal you're trying to get her to take to, and then you give her a tranquilizer. Peter did all that something like 9, 10 o'clock at night. He skinned the foal, put it on the mare, and the mare woke up, took to the foal, thought it seemed a bit odd, took to it. Next day, absolutely fine. The mare is suckling beautifully, and the foal is far better off than if she'd stayed with Peritine, who didn't give a damn that the foal had disappeared. When she came out of being tranquilized, oh, well, good, I can get on with eating now. So she's got a very good uterus, but not a very good udder. So this may be a pattern if we get her in foal this year to do again. So she's one I'll follow. There's the others that you can never follow the ones that you sell until they start to race. There's a 3-year-old in Ireland by Telescope that looks very promising. She's with Dennis Lee here, and I like her very much. But basically, I keep back 2 or 3 fillies every year. Dennis has them. Dennis's mission is to train them properly and break them properly and teach them to jump. But his other big mission is to tell me if they're no good. Because if they're not going to be any good as racehorses, there is no point anyone racing them, me or a syndicate or anyone. There's no point having a syndicate take a horse and then be disappointed. It's no fun for me, it's no fun for them. So Dennis's job is to say, is this horse any good? He can't say she's going to be outstanding, but he can say if she's not going to be any good. And so the ones that will go into training are the ones that Dennis says have promise. They don't. Well, if you want names, Peritine's foal, since I've been outvoted on Visions of Joanna once already, I may be again, she'll probably be called Periscope, which is a very boring name, but with 2 R's, from Peritine and Telescope. Martin Stevens thought of that. So she'll be called that. The one in Ireland may be called Candle in the Wind if I can get it. I haven't done that yet. Not thought of names, but if anyone wants to send an email, I'll send them a list of any horses I've got, and if any of them that are showing promise, I'll tell them. So if you give my email address, I've no problem with that.
Great. Well, it sounds very exciting. And Bryan, let's just take one more question. Kathy Baby has asked, it seems to be becoming common for flat horses to be retired after perhaps only 1 season, even as a 2-year-old. Yeah. Would you think about taking on a stallion that's had such a short season? And what's your view about some of the flat owners that seem to be so focused on their stallion value as opposed to actually getting on and racing their horses?
Well, I'll take the second one first. No, I'll take the first one first. I wouldn't look at a stallion that has only run as a 2-year-old in the flat for a very simple reason. It won't have run over 1.5 miles, and it won't. It's highly unlikely to have got a time form rating of 125 plus. Otherwise, it'd be a flat stallion. So there's no way I'd be interested in it. You want jump horses to have high cruising speed and the toughness to race at 3, 4, and beyond. So it's not something that appeals to me. I think that it has become endemic in the flat industry because they're obsessed with speed. The reason we could get Telescope as a stallion is the flat studs wouldn't have bought him because he didn't win a Group 1. He was second in the King George when he overheated in the stables that day and was giving Tagruda, I think, 15 pounds and ran a very good race against her, but he didn't win a Group 1, so not viable for them. We then got him for 1/10 of the price that he would have brought if he'd won that Group 1. So they're obsessed with speed. I think they're over-obsessed with it. But that's got worse in recent years because of one horse, probably Dark Angel, who retires as a 2-year-old, shouldn't have succeeded according to most metrics that I do, but did. There are always exceptions. He succeeded, and then they followed it. Oh, this one's not going to make it at 3, we'll retire it. This one's not going to make it, we'll retire it. I think it's crazy for the breed. In terms of the obsession with the value of the stallion, unfortunately, that's been shown so far at least the last 70 years, maybe longer. The Aga Khan told you to Ireland at the end of his 3-year-old career after he'd won Derby and St. Leger, before my time, but I have read about it. Lots of people, it's got better with middle distance horses in recent years. Because there's less demand for them as stallions, they tend to keep them in training. The thing that happened was when they kept Brantley training at 4, because he was able to prove what a fantastic racehorse he was at 3. So some of the ones that are altruistic do keep them in training. It's a minority, and it's probably people that are very, very rich.
Bryan, it's been an absolutely fascinating hour. I'm very, very grateful for you giving up your time. I think we've all learned a huge amount about the industry, about your views, and about racing in general. So thank you very much indeed for your time. I've got one final question for you,
right.
And that is, do you know where I am today?
Yeah, you've gone all the way to Cheltenham just to present this. Very good. Thanks very much. I'm really honoured, Dan, that you've gone all the way to Cheltenham and broken the quarantine to do this live from the course with total social distancing all around you, I notice.
There's no one in sight, and it's even still sunny, so I've done very well. Bryan, thank you very much indeed. Really has been a pleasure speaking to you, and I very much appreciate your time.
No, it's been a pleasure for me too, Dan. Thanks very much for asking me.
So that was Bryan Mayoh, and thank you very much indeed to him, and thank you all for joining us for what was our last webinar. So well done for those of you that made it through all 10 of our webinars. We've had some fascinating speakers, and I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. So thank you very much indeed for joining me here at Cheltenham, and hopefully it won't be too long before we'll get to see everyone on the racecourse back racing. Take care, and hopefully we'll see you all soon.